Good evening, everyone. My name is John Kiernan. I'm president of the New York City Bar Association, and it's a pleasure to welcome you to this convening for discussing strategies for rebuilding Puerto Rico. We here at the City Bar formed a Puerto Rico task force, and Roger Maldonado agreed to be its chair about 18 months ago, out of a strong sense that New York City had two particularly intimate forms of connection with the complex issues emanating from that island. First, as home to the greatest concentration of Puerto Ricans anywhere in the world other than the island of Puerto Rico itself, and second, as home to many of the large financial institutions who were the lenders on the debts that were not being repaid. We recognized that there were complications of enormous scale on both sides of those issues, and that Puerto Rico's particular status as a territory added all kinds of additional layers of complexity to a problem already made enormously complex by the scale of the default. It seemed evident that important issues worthy of thoughtful and informed discussion would attach to the challenges proposed by the PROMESA legislation, by the tension between the imperatives of financial oversight and the democratic importance of permitting elected officials to govern as they were elected to do, and by the competing values of needed austerity to spend money that wasn't there and to begin paying down debts on one hand, and needed and essential baseline protections for basic human rights and needs, and stimulus to help get Puerto Rico moving onto a recovery path on the other. And that enormously complex set of issues was all before last fall's hurricane season devastated the island, triggering enormous needs for humanitarian relief and for reconstruction of essential infrastructure, shutting down economic activity, setting back recovery, and stimulating a significant surge of departures from the island. What was already a complicated set of problems obviously became more so in ways that have separately engaged the City Bar. In fact, only in another part of this floor tonight, a collection of volunteer lawyers are working on FEMA appeals for displaced Puerto Rican victims of Hurricane Maria placed through the Burgos Center in East Harlem this evening and every Monday of the first few months of this year. The disaster has made the need for spending for reconstruction evident, creating a sense of need to think even further about how to balance all these competing considerations, and at least some small sliver of hope that the expenditures that are needed will take place, and that those expenditures will, in some measure at least, with hope whose certainty is that now at this point indeterminate, provide some basis for creating jobs and helping to begin the turnaround that is so desperately sought and needed for the island. We couldn't have a better panel of thoughtful participants in these issues and thinkers about these issues than the panel that's assembled before you tonight. Many thanks to Roger Maldonado, who is currently serving double duty as the chair of the task force on Puerto Rico and president-elect of the City Bar to take over in that position on May 15th. And thanks to Kathleen Wild for agreeing to moderate the panel, and to our distinguished panelists, whom Kathleen will introduce to you. Roger?
I will be brief. Welcome. I just want to mention briefly that since its creation, the task force has been focusing on several issues, but I want to first start by thanking John Kiernan for having created the task force in the first place, because it is obviously an issue of importance to me and to everyone here who is present, and it is very fortunate that when I become City Bar president, I won't be tasked on looking to create interest in the city bar in Puerto Rico because John Kiernan has already taken care of that. So, John, thank you very much. Since its creation, the task force initially started focusing on what was happening in terms of the interaction between the government of Puerto Rico and the Oversight Board, and also what began to be happening in the courts. And in that capacity, we did write a letter to Jaime El Curi, General Counsel of the Oversight Board, in March of last year, urging the board to give enough time to all stakeholders, including all residents of Puerto Rico, to both understand, consider, and comment on the proposed fiscal plan. Obviously, after the hurricane, things changed dramatically. So rather than focusing primarily on court proceedings and interactions within Puerto Rico, the task force started thinking about what must happen with respect to rebuilding Puerto Rico. And that is why we are here tonight. The task force also, shortly after the hurricane, wrote a letter to the Department of Homeland Security urging that there be a suspension for 1 year of the shipping restrictions on Puerto Rico that are imposed through the Jones Act. In light of the 10-day suspension, the task force is likely to consider further actions to urge either a permanent or a more long-term lifting of the restrictions. In November of 2017, the task force also wrote a letter to FEMA urging that there be a continuation and extension of the period of time during which applications such as those that are being worked on now may be properly filled out and registered with FEMA. And that, fortunately, has happened. The work of the task force is going to be driven in great part by what happens tonight. The task force will meet to take into account everything that is discussed tonight and to decide how best to go forward. And it will also be considering what measures might be required to deal with the ongoing additional crisis in Puerto Rico, the foreclosure crisis. So there's much to be done. Many members of the task force are here tonight. So now I would like to turn to my primary duty, which is to introduce Catherine Wild, our moderator. Ms. Wild has served since 2001 as the president and the CEO of the Partnership for New York City. And the partnership is the city's leading business organization. Its mission, however, is to work with government, labor, and civic organizations to build a stronger New York with a particular focus on education, infrastructure, and the economy. And in that regard, she's already well qualified to lead this discussion, but Ms. Wild has the additional benefit of having very strong ties to Puerto Rico. She, together with her husband, Wilfredo Lugo, have a home in Puerto Rico. And at her initiative and at Governor Cuomo's behest, Ms. Wild has been very active in recent efforts to support organizations to provide relief for the victims of the hurricane, and more importantly, for planning on how to build Puerto Rico back. So, Kathy, you have the floor.
Thank you, Roger, and I am pleased and humbled to be with you to focus tonight on a discussion of Puerto Rico and its future. I have found that despite a 100-year association with the United States, Puerto Rico is not well understood, and the issues that it faces are very complex. Some of those require lawyers, others require just regular people. So it looks like we have a good combination of that tonight to talk about some of these issues, both legal, humanitarian, et cetera. The panelists represent a great resource. So let me just introduce Jaime El Curi, who is the General Counsel of the Financial Oversight and Management Board for Puerto Rico, Edwin Melendez, who is the Director of the Center for Puerto Rican Studies at Hunter College, and he, like me, is a non-lawyer. Annette Martinez, who is the Executive Director at the Caribbean Institute for Human Rights in Puerto Rico, and finally, Christian Sobrino, who is the Governor of Puerto Rico's representative on the Financial Oversight and Management Board for Puerto Rico. And we're going to open the conversation just by putting today's crisis, both the fiscal crisis and the crisis precipitated by the hurricanes, in a historical context. And I asked each of the panelists to cite one or two of the factors that they see as, since 1917, when the neocolonial relationship with Puerto Rico was established, what do they see as what has happened? What have been the most important historical events or decisions that have set the stage for the current conditions, the status of fiscal economic stability, and the collapse of the infrastructure that is so afflicting the island today? So I'm going to ask each of them to respond to that in a historical context, and I'm going to start with Edwin and Annette, so we get sort of the non-lawyer view, and then we'll move to the lawyers. Well, Annette will do some lawyering.
Buenas noches. Gracias. It's a great pleasure to be here with you. Let me get to the task here quickly. There are many laws that have affected, shaped Puerto Rico through history. We can talk from, from citizenship to the Revenue Act that introduced triple tax exemption, which eventually led to part of where we are now, Section 936, that many of you know what it is. But I want to focus on a couple of them that are particularly key for this juncture. The first one is that in 1994, for reasons that still elude many experts, Puerto Rico was removed from access to the bankruptcy procedures under the American Bankruptcy Code. That eventually triggered the biggest problems that we have, which was that municipalities couldn't actually restructure their operations and their finances when it was clear that we had a crisis. And the other one, besides PROMESA, I will say, is the American Affordable Care Act, because the Affordable Care Act has an intrinsic structural imbalance with respect to Puerto Rico, and it leads to deficits that are now problematic and that Congress has not found a way to resolve.
Annette?
Buenas noches a todos y todas. Puerto Rico's current situation can only be understood in relation to its historical marginalization and its overexploitation by the sovereign power exercising control both over its resources and its human capital. Our economic structure has never been an independent or autonomous act of our government alone. By design, our economy has always been such that works in the benefit of the U.S. financial structure. See, it was always the imperial power the one deciding what we should do and what we can do. It has always imposed limitations, of course, on what we can do. But they have designed our economy on their behalf, on the benefit of their behalf. First, the exploitation of our agriculture for the exportation of sugar and coffee. Then the industrialization came in, along with the castration of our agricultural sector for the sake of manufacturers. Then the pharmaceutics came in, and more recently, we have been made a haven for the market of multinationals at the expense of our people's exploitation in low-paying temporary jobs that are never enough to grow out of poverty. So it's been always the sovereign's decision to do whatever works, and this means exploiting our territory. And that is, in my view, the underlying fact of our economic structure. It is a colonial system, and it is the colonial way of handling a territory. So for me, and for many others directly affected by these too long time policies, the approval of PROMESA, and the appointment of members of the Fiscal Control Board is not other than an additional act of the colonial power exercised over our territory.
So, thank you.
Just one point more. The surprising aspect of it is that ultimately the entirety, you understand what I mean, responsibility of this mess is precisely the responsibility of the same entity imposing the FCB. So it is the US government, it is the government, the US government, the only controller, the only real controller of our economic structure, and it has a fiduciary responsibility over our territory that it hasn't accepted as of yet. Thank you.
As a contemporary example of the problem, I was reading about some of the history and issues on the Jones Act, and as of the time of the hurricane, as of today, the stats were that 90% of the food in Puerto Rico is still imported, when this is the most verdant agricultural island imaginable. So
Exactly.
it's a good indication of what the comments that Annette made. Let me turn now to talk to the lawyers to answer the same question and sort of talk about what, maybe more specifically, about specific laws, regulations, lack of regulations. Christian, you want to?
Well, following up on what Annette said, I'd like to first take the opportunity to say something to not only the government of the City of New York, the government of the State of New York, the Puerto Rican community in New York, all the nonprofits, all the business leaders, everybody across the United States, that during that month and after the hurricane, and for the weeks that have followed after, including today, have actually gone to the island or have called to help the island and have broken their backs working for us. Thank you. Response, it's not only something that you measure at the upper echelons of any government, it's something that you measure with your citizens, with your fellow citizens, with the people that have their hearts directly towards the island. Thank you, and thank you on behalf not only of the government, but on everybody that lives on the island. Because if it were not for that effort, we would definitely not, we would like to be better off than we are today, but we would definitely not be in this situation we're today without that help. So again, thank you. Regarding events since 1917, I think that you can't bring it down to just two, right? If you're speaking purely from a legal standpoint, I think that opinions that were drafted by the Secretary of Justice in Puerto Rico regarding debt issuance back in the 70s formed the basis for how debt was issued by the government of Puerto Rico and instrumentalities for decades after. If you take it from also from a tax point of view, the approval of Section 936 and then its repeal, and how the government of Puerto Rico reacted in 2000 forward in response to that repeal has definitely an effect on where we are today. The decapitalization of the GDB, the Government Development Bank, in the early aughts had also an effect on that. Ultimately, the continued territorial ambiguity of the island is the main cause behind the situation, because it makes it financial planning on a mid and long term is a difficult effort in and of itself when you are in a status or when you're in a condition where the economic levers or the federal levers that control that affect that financial planning are completely out of your grasp, then that also ends up causing this type of crisis. So we have actually, this is not the first crisis that Puerto Rico faces, but it is a continued situation where every time there is a crisis in the island, the ultimate levers that can fix the situation are outside the grasp of the people on the island.
Maybe you could mention the recent tax bill as an example.
Well, you would have the tax bill, but I think anybody in this room from any side of the aisle will have their own pick of measures. You could have some people here feel very strongly about the Jones Act, or about Section 936, or about the ACA funding gap that was provided that was done when Obamacare was passed. Or you can even go back to the Balanced Budget Act of '98, which was the measure that established mandatory benefits for our state Medicaid program without the actual funding that's provided to states. So again, you can go across the years, and you're going to see different instances where key decisions taken at the federal level impact the economic and the fiscal conditions on the island, and the residents and the citizens on the island do not have a grasp on those levers.
Jaime?
Okay. ¿Qué tal? Buenas noches. I'm going to, given my background, so people know, my background is I'm a lawyer. I worked in private practice really for all my life since I graduated from law school, and I worked in a firm called Cleary Gottlieb and I started there in 1980, and my life there was really dedicated to this sort of thing, but from a very different perspective, which was that I worked a lot with Latin America. So I worked a lot in the, particularly to bring it home to Kathy's question, I worked a lot during the 80s in Latin America with the Latin American debt crisis. The Latin American debt crisis was something not very different, I think, from what we're seeing with respect to Puerto Rico. Latin America did not have, like Edwin says, Puerto Rico does not have the bankruptcy protections. Latin America did not have any bankruptcy protections at the sovereign level. Latin America had large fiscal imbalances. Revenues and expenditures were not in sync, particularly because of large subsidies by the government, and particularly because in the 80s, Latin America had, the Latin American public sector included a lot of state-owned companies, airlines, petroleum companies, electricity companies, all the roads, everything. So why do I bring this up? Because in the 80s, and that's the point here, in the 80s, Latin America did something about it. It was very difficult. It exacted a lot of sacrifice from the population, but they did something about it. They righted their finances. They restructured their debt. They had to do it on a very consensual, voluntary basis. Those were long, year-long, it was a decade of negotiations. The Latin American debt crisis started in August 1982. It wasn't really, the first major breakthrough was really in 1990, so that's 8 years, almost a decade. And they did something about also their fiscal imbalances, particularly the fact that their public sector was so much larger than the private sector. So they, I'm going to use maybe a bad word, they privatized a lot of state-owned companies. So they went through that very difficult period in the 80s, And I'm not saying that now they're the brightest star in the world financial and economic universe, but they're not very far behind in many, many aspects in terms of being a real leader. You have Mexico, you have Chile, you have now Argentina doing quite well. And interestingly, Puerto Rico did not follow that path at that point. I'll leave it there. I will leave it there. I will add on as we go along in the discussion. But Puerto Rico at that point, and I always look back, I'm not a politician or anything, I'm just a lawyer, a private practitioner who dealt with Latin America, and I always wondered why there was this incredible diversion between Latin America, of which, frankly speaking, I think Puerto Rico is a part of, and Puerto Rico. What happened there that the two paths diverted so much?
You don't think it was lack of sovereign powers?
I think, as I said, Kathy, I'm not a politician, so I have to look at it from the point of view of I will answer the question later on because I think you're going to ask other questions that will prompt me to give you more concrete examples of why I think that divergence took place.
Okay, so I just want to go back and talk about the difference, and I think this is a good lead-in, the difference between having sovereign powers and not being eligible for the IMF or whatever the resources are that sovereign nations have, and Puerto Rico's situation. How else would you characterize, for those people who are not as familiar with it, the difference between Puerto Rico's situation and those of the 50 states in terms of the ability, the powers, the resources of the two? Edwin, you want to take that?
Yes, I want to, I'm an economist by training, so I'm going to focus a little bit on some indicators that tell you a little bit about where Puerto Rico is in comparison to other states. To begin with, the general debt in Puerto Rico in 2016, according to the governor's report to the Oversight Board at the time, was $64.169 billion. In comparison to the gross domestic product, that at the time was 70 billion give and take, that's 91.5% ratio, right? Now, to put that in a context, in the United States, the two states with the largest debt ratio are Connecticut with 14.46% and Massachusetts with 14.48%. So in that spectrum, Puerto Rico is way out there with other international cases, Argentina, Greece, and other cases where this question of the debt ratio has gotten really out of hand to the point where we are now. But that's not the whole story. I'm going to give you a couple more indicators. To begin with, in Puerto Rico, the participation rate, that is the number of people that are in the labor force, which is an indicator, or the employment rate for that matter, of what is the population that sustain the economy, right? Who are the people that go every day out to work and generate economic development in Puerto Rico. In Puerto Rico, that rate is 44.7%. In the United States, it's 63.1% overall. Puerto Ricans in the United States are in the 62.2, not too far from the average for the whole population. So Puerto Rico's participation in the job market it's about 2/3 of what it is in the United States. So someone has to produce for the economy to be entangled.
And that was what year?
That's 2016. Okay, that's the latest.
What was it before the end of 936? Do you know?
Oh,
always been that rate.
It's always been low. It's always been low, and that has to do with a problem with demand, with the labor market generating jobs for the people there, and the solution for us is obviously migration. I'll get there at some point tonight. Having said that, the poverty rate in Puerto Rico for all families is 39.4%. For all people, it's 43.5%. In comparison, those two rates in the U.S. are 10% and 14%. So the lack of jobs generate this tremendous population in poverty. For children under 5, in Puerto Rico, the rate is 64%, okay, for children. The poverty rate, should I say that again? The poverty rate for children in Puerto Rico under 5 years old is 64%. In comparison, in the States, it's 21.3%. Having said that, let me give you a couple more indicators, okay? In Puerto Rico, 22% of the housing stock is vacant, okay? And a lot of that vacancy or vacant units are resilient to storms. They're just empty, while the poor lives in areas that are not resilient to storms and other things. So in Puerto Rico, you don't have to build housing. What you need are policies that will convert vacant homes into social purposes. Okay, let me stop there. So in terms of health care, Medicaid covers more than half of the population, and Medicare covers another 11%. So about 2/3 of the population in Puerto Rico depends on the American government for subsidization of their health care, okay? Having said that, the reimbursement to Puerto Rico is capped at 55%, while in other states, the rates go up to 80%, okay? So that disparity in what is covered of Medicare and the fact that you have to appropriate every year creates a structural problem for the government to finance health care. Finally, I'm going to give you a brief example, and I cut this. You have the situation of earned income tax credit and child tax credit. If you have two families, one in Puerto Rico and one in the United States, in 2015, they both made $28,000. They all pay the same Medicare and Social Security taxes. In this example, $1,700 in Social Security and $406 in Medicare taxes. Guess what? The family in the United States that doesn't pay any taxes, federal taxes yet, just like the family in Puerto Rico, okay, received a subsidization of $4,600 in earned income tax and $2,000 now with the new law of child tax credit. Child tax credit, okay? That means that the family that resides in the United States earns 26% more than the family in Puerto Rico, both not paying federal taxes, okay? Those are the inequities in the system and the relationship that we have with the United States that we need to attend to.
Thank you. Annette, did you want to add anything?
I think those numbers are staggering, but it simply shows that there is no comparison between Puerto Rico, which is a territory and a colony of the United States, and the other 50 states, as there is no comparison between Puerto Rico and Latin American countries. And I thought we were, here to talk about Puerto Rico. And if we want to talk about austerity measures and how they impact the economy of Puerto Rico, we should do that. But if we want to talk about Mexico and how austerity measures actually made an impact on them, we can do that as well, okay? Because it's not just about balancing your budget. When we talk about the economy, in the case of Puerto Rico, and the crisis that we have, we need to talk about the people living in the territory of Puerto Rico and how all of those measures have an impact on their rights. So I thank Jaime for introducing some aspects of his experience in Mexico and in other Latin American countries, but the situation is very different when you have a sovereign country that can actually have access to international markets and make decisions on their economic policies, which we don't have.
Maybe we should let Jaime respond to draw his analogy.
I take Annette's point quite well, and I think
Okay, sit down and we're going to stop.
obviously she's right that you cannot make comparisons between a completely sovereign country and Puerto Rico. But I just to address your question, Kathy, in terms of Puerto Rico and the 50 states, another important factor, I think it is, that Puerto Rico's economy, as Christian, Edwin, and Annette have mentioned, had for some time manufacturing as the backbone. And in fact, I think even today, the manufacturing sector is still the most important sector. That is very different, for what I'm going to say, from the other 50 states. Why? Because Puerto Rico's manufacturing sector is basically export-oriented. Puerto Rico's manufacturing sector is a manufacturing sector where all of what it produces really is exported, pharmaceuticals, electronics, whatever. Why am I mentioning this? This is very different from the other 50 states. And in that sense, sorry, Annette, I'm going to say it again, but in that sense, it's very similar to many Latin American economies that have restructured, which are really export-oriented. Chile, Mexico nowadays with NAFTA is an export-oriented country. Why is that important? It is important because the only way that you can be able to grow a manufacturing sector that is export-oriented is by being competitive. You have to be competitive in terms of world prices. And Puerto Rico, in that sense, I think, in a sense, if you're going to bet on manufacturing, and if you're going to bet on a manufacturing sector that is export-oriented, you have to have costs that are competitive with the rest of the world. That means electricity, that means water, that means, yes, labor, that means a lot of the inputs that go. Puerto Rico relied for most of its history on one competitive factor only, and that was taxes. It had a very low tax base, therefore, it was able to compete with the rest of the world in terms of exports on that basis. That ended for two reasons. One, 936 was eliminated, therefore that tax subsidy went away. But even more interestingly, I think, the rest of the world caught on and lowered their taxes. So the rest of the world equalized to Puerto Rico, and that's why you have a Singapore, I'm sorry to bring this country, Singapore, you have Ireland, et cetera, which are now competing against Puerto Rico. Puerto Rico has to open its eyes and see, if you're going to bet on manufacturing, you have to open your eyes and see this reality.
Well, that certainly is, pardon me. I think the same, though, is true of Ohio and Pennsylvania. I mean, we all lost our competitiveness in manufacturing. So I think that's an area where they're the same. I want to move now to, since we're moving that direction, the Fiscal Control Board.
Can I mention, there's a figure that typically when we're talking about demographics and comparing to states and other countries, there's in the context of Puerto Rico, we're always speaking of demographics. There has been consistently a 2% drop in population, net drop between 1.6, 1.8, you can round it up to 2. It's been year over year. The number that's rarely spoken about is the drop in population of children under the age of 5. And when you look at the Census Bureau data from 2000 to 2015, the drop is 42%. So if you imagine right now, wherever you live, every child under the age of 5, 42% disappears. That's what's been happening in Puerto Rico for the past 15 or some years. So when you then look at the letter over there that says rebuilding for whom, you're trying to rebuild for an increasing population of children under the age of 5. And the way you do that is, regardless of where you, if it's Latin America or in any state or in any city, is you have to provide investment in the human capital that can not only function adequately or compete in manufacturing, but that also is able to leverage other sectors of the economy when Puerto Rico is underperforming. So for example, in tourism or in visitors economy, Puerto Rico is the only island in the Caribbean or in the Atlantic Basin where tourism or visitors economy represents less than double digits in its GNP or GDP. About 7 to 9%, depending on when you count it. And we're talking on a region that has a communist island, that has sovereign island, that has other U.S. territories, that has every single possible language, flag, ideology, or ethnicity that you can imagine, but Puerto Rico is the only one that is below double digits. Same with labor participation rates. So it's not really an issue of manufacturing, is what structure do you have in your economy that is investing in human capital that is then determining by itself to stay on the island and develop any type of business or any type of self-promotion, be it as an employee or as an entrepreneur or as a public servant. Because when you have that drop in the age of the population, and you go back to that number, a 42% drop in children under the age of 5, what you're really talking about is a long-term viability question for the island. It's not about manufacturing or labor laws. It's about what is the environment in the island holistically that can provide that could make that arrow go in the other direction up. That's how you go to growth.
We haven't mentioned education, and that's a really, when you look at the statistics on education in Puerto Rico, it's deteriorated. I remember in the 80s, when I first looked at the numbers, Puerto Rico had a higher percentage per capita of professional degrees than any country in the world. And and they were the scientists going to NASA from Mayagüez, and I mean, it was an amazing thing. Lots of lawyers and
Too many lawyers.
and many lawyers, accountants, and professionals. Today, that's simply not the case, and it has to do with the migration. Do you want to comment a little bit about that now?
Yes, I think this is the right point to bring the whole role of migration. Let me give you an entry point. For the first time over many decades, probably since the 30s, Puerto Rico had more death than birth last year, okay? That's called a demographic winter. It's affecting, Japan, Eastern Europe, and many countries, right? But that's not the context. Why is that happening in Puerto Rico such an accelerated way in comparison to other countries? Because child-rearing families have been migrating since 2006 to the United States, okay? The exodus from Puerto Rico is it has an overrepresentation of young families between the ages of 25 and 45 raising children, right? So all that population growth that the Puerto Rican community has is here in the States. Think about this. In 2008, there were equal number of Puerto Ricans in the United States and Puerto Rico, okay? Equal number. 2006, at the beginning of the recession. Today, there's about over 5.5 million in the States and less than 3.4 million in Puerto Rico. That's an incredible, when you put that in a graphic, it's an incredible shift in the Puerto Rican population. Okay, think about that. Now, moving forward, between 2008 and last year, more than 500,000 Puerto Ricans left Puerto Rico. Think, in the 1950s, the Great Migration, the so-called Great Migration, was about 600,000 people in the mid to late 50s, okay? It was a push from the government of Puerto Rico to get surplus labor out of the island, so to speak, right? Guess what? Last year, we almost matched that. Over the last 10 years, we almost matched that, except that it hasn't finished. We estimate that another 500,000 will live between 2 and 3 years moving forward. That depopulation of Puerto Rico is the biggest impediment to economic development in the island. There is no economic basis for development. Let me stop there.
Well, let's move to then the discussion about the conditions that resulted in the fiscal crisis and the Oversight Board, and then we'll move on to talk about how the storms piled on top of that. Maybe to talk about the fiscal crisis, the creation of the PROMESA, its role and responsibilities. So what are the conditions that led to the fiscal crisis, and more importantly, what's the current status? Are we all getting along? What are the issues as you, Wednesday, Christian, present the budget or the fiscal plan?
I think it depends on the day. Overall, I think so what led to, if the question is what led to the Oversight Board or PROMESA as a structure, or PROMESA as a law, it's a straightforward answer in that there was a public debt issue where eventually public debt was not paid, and Puerto Rico as a jurisdiction did not have a holistic legal framework to attend to that debt. Now there's, for example, if you take for a state, Chapter 9 covers cities. It covers municipal entities. It doesn't cover the state overall, or at least I haven't read an interpretation that would provide that. But in the case of Puerto Rico, when you had a debt issue across all issuers, including the central government, there was no holistic legal framework that could provide that. So the PROMESA is, in essence, a response to that debt situation. The Oversight Board, now you could have a restructuring or a consensual legal framework to renegotiate debt if you chose to, or if you could. That didn't include the Oversight Board. The Oversight Board is an add-on to that judicial or legal framework. Now, when you look to Washington, D.C., which I think, although it can't be compared to Puerto Rico, it is the only district or jurisdiction that went through an oversight board, or in that case, it was a complete, full control board that supplanted all semblance of home rule. There, you had not only the president of that oversight board, but the vice chairman of that oversight board and all other members go to Congress and say, you know what, we've been cutting and we've been trying to balance the budget for 2 years, and we haven't even moved the needle. And this is actually documented in a study by Appleseed. And the reason they identified that they couldn't move the needle with all those cuts and all those measures was that there was a structural imbalance in the relationship between Washington, D.C. and the federal government, period. And it's well documented. And it is when then the federal government passes a second legislation that covers some of those imbalances, although not all of them, that you actually see some kind of relief in certain areas, although Washington, D.C. still has to struggle with certain problems. So overall in Puerto Rico, it goes back to a relationship between the jurisdiction and the federal government that is structurally imbalanced, that is always changing, and that the decisions taken at one point affect the other one without necessarily having participation in that decision-making process. Now, exactly, it's a federal, you can describe it, well, you can have a problematic relationship. It's still a relationship, right? So that's, overall, that is the issue that comes up. You have that structural imbalance.
You've got a fiscal plan you're going to submit on Wednesday, the government has?
Yes.
And are you able to submit a stabilization program in that plan?
Well, the commitment we have with the Oversight Board and with creditors and the public is that we will make, once we submit the fiscal plan as required by the Oversight Board, we make it public, and then we can discuss it in front of everybody.
Plan to privatize everything?
Okay, if we're going to have,
We've sell off Puerto Rico? Is that the plan?
we've accommodated the silent protest. We're not going to accommodate interruptions.
Speech.
Well, they have the freedom of speech first, and then we'll have.
Violate our human rights.
Is there going to be a question and answer component?
Yes, we'll have some questions and answers. So so long as things stay quiet. So the fiscal plan. I know you can't tell the details of it, but is there a fiscal plan that you can rationally submit without these changes in the structural problems, whether it's the Medicaid or the Jones Act or whatever? I mean, just in theory.
You can conduct some financial planning. You can conduct some financial planning based on the best available information at hand, and a reasonable and a responsible exercise in preparing assumptions and planning. You can do that. Now, what is critical to understand is the true structural issue in Puerto Rico is not necessarily budgets or a law that provides maternity leave or some other kind of measure like that. The true cause of the situation, it has to do with its status. It has to do with how the island is either imposed upon or related with the federal government. And the overall improvement or resolution of that issue is what will provide long-term stability to the people in Puerto Rico.
Jaime, I assume you would agree with that.
Yeah, I think there are a lot of issues that have to be resolved, Kathy. I mean, it's Puerto Rico has a very difficult history, as I was mentioning before. Even the Jones Act is an issue, as people have mentioned here, obviously, because it affects the competitiveness of the Puerto Rican economy.
Does the Oversight Board think that they can get a reasonable fiscal plan without
Okay.
addressing some of these issues?
Yeah, I think, the fiscal plan is the basis of two things, basically. The fiscal plan is the basis to try to restructure the finances of the government, to bring it to fiscal balance, to make revenues equal to expenses.
Election agency for their hedge fund vultures. Say the truth.
Sir?
Well, that's the second part, but let me finish with the first part, and we'll go to the second part. The first part is fiscal balance, to make Puerto Rico a economically viable unit. Now, that, I agree, has a large component that depends, historically has depended on federal funds. That's volatile. Who knows? That's whatever happens in Washington and the interaction between Washington and Puerto Rico. But I think you can construct something that has reasonable assumptions in terms of those federal funds. Hurricane Maria obviously has put dropped a monkey wrench into that equation. But I think you can make reasonable assumptions on the variables to bring fiscal balance to Puerto Rico. This fiscal plan, unlike the first fiscal plan was based on a 10-year horizon. Understanding that the situation is quite different post-Hurricane Maria and Hurricane Irma, the fiscal plan now has been reduced to 5 years. Try to bring fiscal balance into 5 years. Now, that's 1A. 1B is that with those measures, bringing Puerto Rico to fiscal balance, you will create the conditions for what I think Edwin is correctly pointing out as the most important factor, which is economic growth. There is obviously the population variable, but the idea behind a fiscal plan is not only to do a fiscal balance of the finances of the government, but to create the conditions for economic growth for Puerto Rico. The second part is what the gentleman was talking about, which is that the fiscal plan also provides the recipe for, at the end of the day, how much is going to be paid out in terms of the debt. You have to do the numbers in terms of the fiscal balance of the government, provide for the services that a government is required to provide to its population, and then you deal with the debt situation. So the fiscal plan is a basis for three things. One, fiscal balance of the figures of the government, the finances of the government, provide the basis for economic growth, and finally, provide the basis for a debt restructuring. I mean, it's not, yeah.
Governor won't even audit that. He's afraid. He knows he's illegal.
Talking again about, if I may, about how we got to the situation where we are today, which was, I think, the question. It is actually, in the case of Puerto Rico, it is a twofold answer. I think there is a twofold answer to that. And first is the one I already mentioned, that our economy is actually, subjected to our territorial status, and we have, we have always been managed and controlled economically by the United States. The second is that our local colonial administrations have also followed or instituted or imposed on Puerto Rico's population decisions that more and more are on the benefit of external investments, and not necessarily looking into how to make the people of Puerto Rico have, their human rights protected and guaranteed. For example, we all know, as have been mentioned before here, that when the Section 936 was taken out by Congress, that was a unilateral decision. We had no part in that decision. And at that point, Section 936 actually was the motor of our economy for a while. When the decision was taken to leave us without Section 936, no substitute was actually included in a plan to provide a new way for our economy to keep growing, or at least running. And according to several economists, local economists in Puerto Rico, including Dr. Jose Caraballo Cueto, after that decision was made, we can see statistically that there was no way for Puerto Rico to actually recover its economic situation. And we also see a decline, an increase in unemployment rates. But later on, we have decisions from local governments, for example, Act 7, Ley 7, which was supposedly approved to actually, attack the issue of gigantismo gubernamental, because apparently our problem was that we had a huge public working force, right? So it was approved, Act 7, this was, I think, in 2006. And later on, what we see is actually that our unemployment rate, instead of going down, it actually increased. And afterwards, we have all of these different measures, austerity measures, being imposed on our population, but at the same time, we see no recovery in our economy. And the surprising thing is that now we have our local government and the Fiscal Control Board actually presenting a fiscal plan, I mean the old one, because we don't know nothing about the new one, but the old fiscal plan proposed new austerity measures and privatization and reducing our public force. And at the same time, we have economists, Joseph Stiglitz, Martín Guzmán, José Caraballo Cueto, José Garavito, and many others from Puerto Rico, and internationally recognized economists saying, hello, you should not keep imposing austerity measures on an already depressed economy.
So that we don't all get too depressed, let me just switch to a moment. Historically, as I recall, when federal disaster aid comes in after a large storm, it's an opportunity to do a turnabout in an economy. And the question is, to what extent is this, and probably most of you know that the government of Puerto Rico, with support from New York State and some foundations, put out an analysis of both the damage assessment of the storms in Puerto Rico and what it will take to recover, and presented a very credible report of a $94.4 billion cost that is going to have to be spent both to deal with the damages, which I think were about 30 billion direct damages.
Depends on the assessment, yeah.
And the rebuilding costs to build so that this doesn't happen again, so that we don't have this loss of the power, et cetera. And so the question is whether or not the players, many of whom are represented or points of view here, can come together to change the dynamic in Washington so that we have a united front to go after this $94 billion, which is the expectation that Florida and Texas and New Orleans had, that the government would make good on this. How are things coming together in that regard? Edwin?
Let me provide a little bit of background to answer the question, okay? And the background is that since July 1st of 2016, Puerto Rico has not paid debt, okay? It was a stay, the case is now in court, so the debt has not been a factor since then, right? But the budget doesn't balance. Why? Because the budget was balanced in years past by borrowing money that's is now not available to Puerto Rico to close the gap, okay? Part of the gap was financed by not paying pensions and bankruptcy, you know, kind of breaking the pension system in Puerto Rico to the point where today is pay as you go, okay? So you have to collect to then pay pensions, right? So we have a situation in which the revenues that you collect as a government are not enough to sustain the services that you have. So even without adding the debt payment, you have a structural deficit in the budget that you have to close. So that's where all the contention comes over, okay? That's before the catastrophe of Hurricane Maria. That was the situation before, prior. Now you add estimated $100 billion in losses over the next 10 years in income for the Puerto Rican population. That's a substantive loss, okay? You have damage to the infrastructure that requires billions of dollars. There's no way we can fundraise enough to cover that cost. So therefore, right, before the catastrophe, we needed an injection of money. Some people call it Marshall Plan, that would have just put in place some items like the earned income tax, parity in health care, and stabilize the government finances from that point. But then you needed to invest in economic development, economic growth. And if you cannot borrow, where are the investments going to come? Where is the money going to come to spur that economy back to action, right? So you needed an injection of capital regardless of Hurricane Maria. Now you add the destruction of Hurricane Maria, you even need a bigger investment. Where is that going to come from? Well, it happens it happens that when you're part of the United States, whether a territory or a state, that's the pact that the federal government, there's a law, the Stratford Law, that says that the federal government has to cover the damage and restore the infrastructure to where it was. To this day, the United States have only sent remedies to what was an emergency situation. There is no money that has gone to Puerto Rico to a long-term reconstruction yet. And the loan that was put in the books is being frozen. My two colleagues can probably talk more about that than I can. But the point is that without an impetus to get that financial help from the federal government, Puerto Rico is going to be decades to get out of where we are. We need a Marshall Plan that now adds reconstruction of the infrastructure. Now, that's the role of the diaspora. That's where we come into the equation, because Puerto Rico needs all the help that they can get, and that's part of what we need to look forward, moving forward to do to support.
And it can't just be Florida. It will take a few more
We're
states.
doing our share, but it's much more to do.
No, I'm saying that turning Florida purple is not going to do it. We got to do better than that.
Never mind. I don't want to get into that one.
So
I just wanted to put some flesh into what Edwin just mentioned. There are three, as I understand it, Christian always corrects me on this. As I understand it, there are three buckets of what you're saying in terms of three major buckets of federal funds. One is the immediate emergency. I think they call it category A and B kind of funding. That I think has been appropriated, and that FEMA is working with that.
Boots on the ground.
It's boots on the ground. The second category is something called community disaster loans, and those have also been appropriated. I think that has been authorized.
There's portion. So the first part to understand with the situation in Puerto Rico is the whole federal disaster relief program is premised that on a disaster occurring in a state that is not completely bankrupt, right? That's why, for example, to this day, Louisiana is still arguing and going back and forth over expenditures for Katrina, because the state was able, and Katrina involved billions of dollars of investment, but the state was able also to spend and then fight out over a decade what it received from the federal government. In the case of Puerto Rico, Hurricane Maria goes right through it as a category, almost a category 5, and the island was already bankrupt or in a fiscal situation that did not allow it to just spend and then worry about reimbursement.
because of the local match requirement.
Not only because of the local match requirement, we're talking about funds in available funds, right? That is why, for example, the cash balance that was published for the local power utility over a month ago was about $500 million, and it was published again and updated on Friday. It's already down half, because you are spending at a level.
Let me just bring what you're saying, Christiana, a little bit even closer so people understand. This is exactly right. This is the first time in the U.S. history where, not in world history, I know Annette doesn't like me to bring Mexico, but Mexico was bankrupt when the earthquake of 1985 happened, and how they dealt with it is a very interesting lesson. But putting that aside, this is the first time in in U.S. history where you have a natural disaster of the enormity of Hurricane Maria with a bankruptcy, in a bankrupt state. What does that mean, just to give you an example? So the federal government is naturally kind of nervous that if they're going to be putting some funds in terms of loans, they're going to be putting those funds into a bankrupt situation. So they want to know a little bit, where do we stand in terms of the current creditors, your hedge funds, the gentleman that asked me, where is the federal government going to be vis-a-vis the hedge funds. That is a novel kind of situation for the federal government, for Puerto Rico, and for the situation we're living in. This is, I think, just to bring home a little bit what Christian is talking about.
Where are the,
but
excuse
that's,
me. Wait, excuse me. Excuse me.
It's true. It's not novel. It's racism. It's colonialism. It's capitalism.
How is this helpful? How is this
That's
helpful?
what it is.
If you're angry, go outside.
We're all angry. We're all fired up. Why not? People are dying in Puerto Rico. This ain't a joke. There's no policies of neoliberal policies that are killing us. The government privatizing today. You destroyed Argentina. Now you're destroying Puerto Rico. Say the truth. It's disgusting.
So what I was looking for was what we agree on, and I was trying to
So-
get a consensus up here whether the government's application for the $94 billion for both the damage assessment and the longer-term rebuilding is something that the Puerto Rican government, the Oversight Board, the people generally agree we should be working together to achieve, the diaspora.
I think nobody will disagree that Puerto Rico should receive as many funds as are possible to rebuild, and that those funds should be managed responsibly. Nobody would ever disagree with that, right? I think the point that has been raised in the case of Puerto Rico is that for some reason, Puerto Rico is a special island where apparently, unlike any other population in the United States, there's this constant question of whether it's going to be managed. When you have other cities and other states where public officials have literally gone to jail after a disaster, in the case of Puerto Rico, the disbursement of relief funds are being dragged out over a question of whether it's going to be managed adequately. That is a ridiculous premise, because there is no reason to believe that Puerto Ricans are not able to be agents in their own recovery efforts. There is no reason to believe that. And actually, you know, this self-flagellation that sometimes we on the island engage in about how things are run in Puerto Rico has had a long track record of successfully managing billions of dollars in funds, even better than maybe some parts in the U.S., where they don't have the same restrictions in the amounts that are available. Tell me which state could run a Medicaid program where you have reimbursement levels at a third than what they are right now and still have it operating. We had billions of dollars that were invested in ARRA funds in 2010, and there was not a single issue with those. So the question has constantly been, oh, well, we have to make sure that they're going to be managed responsibly. Why is it in the case of Puerto Rico there is this special suspicion regarding where it's going to be managed responsibly when we have been able to do it before and we will be able to do it again?
I understand that, but you know, the fact, you're totally right. I mean, I'm not arguing with that, but there is a reality, which is that Puerto Rico is in a, you know, financial distress, and therefore the question has to arise, you know, how can you manage the situation in a financial distress environment? I mean, it's not an unreasonable question.
It is a reasonable question, but I'm talking about rebuilding a bridge, right? So when you rebuild critical infrastructure, when you are doing improvements to your housing stock, when you are fixing your electrical grid, et cetera, those are basic needs that you have to cover some way or the other. So the question of whether, yes, there have to be controls in place, but we are equally capable of doing that. We have proven so before than any other jurisdiction in the United States. There's no reason, there's no evidence to the contrary on that.
I don't think Puerto Rico is that unique when it comes for Congress to look into you know, how the monies are going to be dispersed. I'm going to give you an example of Katrina, New Orleans, and Katrina. At the time, the perception was that there was a lot of corruption in that jurisdiction, and that to send the money directly to the local state agencies would have been a miscalculation of, you know, moving forward. So an independent entity was created, the Reconstruction Agency, that got the funding, and some oversight and fiscal controls were imposed because of the perception, realistic or not. You know, New Orleans had a reputation for concatenation of things, and I will say Puerto Rico is not too far in the history, when you look at 20 or 30 years of cases of mismanagement and corruption. Now, whether it's right or not, I don't know, but that's the perception in Congress. So the question is, moving forward, my understanding is a proposal on the table to create an independent agency. The question is, what is the oversight to that, and what is the balance between the Fiscal Oversight and Management Board? But I do think that whatever comes out of this, there got to be a plan that accounts for not just the input from various stakeholders and a process that is more porous and democratic than what we normally would have in Puerto Rico because of the dire situation that the island is. And the participation of the population in Puerto Rico is so critical that I think thinking about what are the instruments and the mechanisms and the agencies that we can put in place to encourage that participation are not a lost exercise, that we really need to think about this. And that we're not going to overcome the perception in Congress just by arguing that we can do it better than whatever, because of the history of Puerto Rico.
Well, in that effect, I mean, we looked at what happened in Louisiana with the Louisiana Recovery Authority, what was done in New York with the government's Office of Storm Recovery, what was done in New Jersey. We built a similar model. And let's look at the levels of oversight that Puerto Rico is going to have its recovery. It's going to be overlooked by state law enforcement, by state fiscal agency, by state inspector general, by federal inspector general, by federal congressional hearings and other typical legislative oversight at the federal congressional level. You're going to have also federal law enforcement overseeing this. And now we have also a federal oversight board that has to review contracts above $10 million. This is going to be the most overseen recovery effort in the history of life.
Let's hope so.
And again, and what we need, not only from the oversight board and from the community, is to recognize that effort and to not engage in this self-flagellation argument in Puerto Rico that somehow we can't be agents in our own recovery. That is a ridiculous a ridiculous statement that has no basis in truth or in any type of fact. Well, Whitefish has been, you know why you found out about Whitefish? Because Puerto Rico, unlike the federal jurisdiction, has all of its contracts public by constitutional mandate. You can't hide them. Ask right now the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers what the rates are for their contracts. You're going to have a confidential stamp this big. So they went through a procurement process. It's been overseen. So the thing is, it's not that things don't occur. They occur, you identify them, and you address them. But you do not strip away a people's agency in recovery because of an incident.
Annette, you were going to say something?
Yes.
Excuse me.
I just wanted to comment that I think there's no justifiable reason for the difference in treatment on the aid program from FEMA. Even more so if you take into consideration that the disaster in Puerto Rico was actually a man-made disaster, and that our situation is actually the result of all of what we have discussed before. Our economic is in distress because of our relationship with the United States and because of the mismanagement issues, yes, but primarily because of our relationship with the United States. And so when the hurricane hit Puerto Rico, it's not that the U.S. government is going to help us. It's that it is their responsibility to actually come in and do the right thing, which is put the money where it's needed.
But there is a larger issue, because I was talking to somebody who said that for Puerto Rico, because it's an island and because it's so dependent on supplies and other materials coming in, because of this loss of dependence over many decades, that the value of the FEMA and the recovery dollars for the electrical utility, they said it would be 10 cents on the dollar, as opposed to if it were in Florida or in Texas, because they're bringing the labor in from outside, they're bringing the supplies in from outside, this discount. They said for housing, it's a little better because some local contractors can work on the housing, but the jobs and economic bump that should be coming out of a multi-billion-dollar investment is a huge issue, and the government is trying to deal with this by working with foundations, there's a whole effort with Rockefeller, with Ford, with Soros to try and put together strengthening of the NGO community, create relationships with between the NGO community and sources of financial support from business to try and build that up to work with the government to make the case in Washington. Because I would just say that if the people of Puerto Rico and the diaspora don't come together to make this case, we're going to end up with the craziness of still not having control of the rebuilding future at a moment when they really need that control.
So
Talk about the diaspora. What are concrete things I can do as one of those members?
I can take that call.
Christian, do you want to respond to that?
Well, I think that any at the end of the day, those funds are approved by elected officials. They're appropriated by elected officials, and they're managed by agencies that respond to those elected officials. So whatever effort can be done to move, to put Puerto Rico on the issues list of as many elected officials at the federal level you can, that is what you need. Because I can tell you that the biggest problem you have is you're dealing right now with a shutdown. You're dealing with disasters in other parts of the United States, and Puerto Rico needs to be kept on the agenda at a top level because it is an important, and this is the only catastrophe that has engulfed a whole jurisdiction. Every other problem, every other hurricane, fire, tornado season, you typically have an edge on the problem. It doesn't cover the whole state. It doesn't cover the whole jurisdiction. Not everybody's a victim of the event, right? You can drive in or you can drive out of the problem. In Puerto Rico, it covers the whole place. At the same time, where you don't have elected officials that vote in that appropriation or in that approval process, right? So that is something that the diaspora is critical in, other than the obvious political or electoral effort. You have a know-how, you have nonprofit organizations, you have experience here dealing with situations similar to the ones that's facing Puerto Rico, even if it is different. And what we did with the Rockefeller Foundation and Open Society and other organizations in preparing that type of recovery plan or in bringing in ideas or moving to the island to help in certain efforts, even if we're well, that is something you can also engage in. And finally, there's also the portion of somehow selecting the organization of your choice and providing financial support that you are sure that is going to get to the island and used responsibly. Those are three elemental actions that can be taken by the diaspora or the community in Puerto Rico.
I think there are three things that we have been doing and we should continue doing. The first one is to build an advocacy coalition that is broad, that is try to avoid partisanship as we move forward, where the policy issues are the agenda
I think
for...
that's really a good point,
for
because
moving forward.
Congress does not understand
Right.
the partisan issues in Puerto Rico, and so if you could put that aside and just make the case. Right?
So since, for a couple of years now, many organizations have built, various activities, partnerships, coalitions to move around Puerto Rico, and with Maria, there was an impetus to even create more networks to support what's happening in Puerto Rico. So that advocacy coalition is critical. The second point is that we need to start strengthening the relationships that we have with the civic sector in Puerto Rico. What Kathy mentioned about strengthening that sector is critically important. Why? Because Puerto Rico is in a stalemate. The political dynamics in Puerto Rico have gotten where we are. We need to strengthen the organization, the civic organizations, the capacity that those organizations bring to break that equation of stalemate between the political parties and everything else that occurs on the political dimensions of the island. And the third thing that we need to do is develop new leadership out of those civic sectors that are emerging in Puerto Rico, and we need to support that. And we support that through various interactions with them, providing all the technical participation, all the reciprocity that we can have with them. We learn from them, they learn from us, but those are critical. We need to develop a hub of information that maintains us on top of what's happening in Puerto Rico, and do so from a neutral perspective with respect to the politics of the island, but yet active with respect to Congress and the agenda that we need to push in the United States.
There's a group called Comprometidos that you can look up their web. There's a
They weren't.
okay.
No, to respond to that, first of all, that's an independent organization. It wasn't used for parks. There was a proposal that was published, but it was not approved. And it has been used, those funds, a lot of those funds have been used. They have a list that is public on where it has invested. And as I said earlier, choose an organization of your liking and one that you trust and that you feel comfortable with. Unidos for Puerto Rico is a responsible organization. It has its board of directors. It has very qualified, very independent, very responsible people that you can also look up if you'd like. But the idea, again, what I'm going at is the idea that there's something special in Puerto Rico where, unlike any other part in the United States, Puerto Ricans cannot manage their own recovery. I'm not saying there's no oversight. Quite to the contrary, we're going to have the most overseen recovery process ever. But we should be the principal agents in designing and in implementing that recovery effort. And it's not only in the government. It's also in the public, in the private sector.
We can't have a conversation. One second. I think we should take a few minutes for questions now. I want to ask for questions, not speeches. Okay, go ahead. I think it's clear. I think everybody agrees. I don't think there's any disagreement. We haven't focused on that conversation here because I think we all take that for granted, and that's certainly part of the agenda, the Medicaid, the Jones Act, the reconciliation of the debt to something that's rational, that all those are pieces that I think there should be agreement on. My frustration in studying this is that we don't show a united front in Washington, and I think that's part of the problem. Yes, sir.
Good evening. Buenas noches a todos.
Question.
Muchas gracias a los participantes, los presentes esta noche. I would like to perhaps shift some of this debate to the topic of resilience, which unfortunately had only been mentioned twice in this idea of the housing stock in Puerto Rico. The reason that Puerto Rico, with all these other risk drivers that happen, long history of economic inequality, but the reason that I think Puerto Rico is in the position that it is in today is because it was not a resiliently designed island. And my question is, how do you envision Puerto Rico not building back, but building back better and more resilient?
Thank you. Christian?
Well, It's a long answer, right? But for example, our flood maps need to be revisited completely, so that people can not only live where they choose to live, but they can live in a place where they can be pretty secure in knowing that if there is a hurricane and there is some kind of atmospheric event, their home is not going to be flooded. And then public officials need to be responsible in enforcing those maps. So that's something that, although it seems it seems that it's not that big of a deal, it is, because it does impact how banks finance mortgages. It impacts what type of flood insurance programs, and it provides also the basis on how the housing stock is developed across the island. An issue we had that we face now also is title. A lot of Puerto Ricans, the way that they have been acquiring their property is not formally recognized in the title process. So you would have your grandfather, your great-grandfather would have land. He would parcel it out to his children and so forth. And that is an issue in how you transfer wealth and in how you actually develop the land, and also goes to that element of resiliency. The energy grid, over 20 years of not providing it the maintenance it required, meant that the grid was already very, well, not saying awful, but it wasn't going to stand up. So, for example, you have infrastructure that it can't be replaced because it's no longer even made, right? You have.
It's like the subways here.
I'm not going to comment on subways on the island.
So, I think
It's a lot of
I
infrastructure.
just want to add that Rockefeller Ford.
I'll just mention one thing quickly. There's an economic concept, and I know I'm going to say something maybe controversial, but there's an economic concept called moral hazard. Moral hazard is if someone pays for it and you don't take the risk, you're bound to take the risk again. So you have to be somewhat careful with this whole concept of the federal government backing up disasters, because that sort of may lead you to where you are, which is that, well, if they're going to pay to rebuild it again, why do I have to make it resilient? If you have situations where you are the one who has to pay for it, you have to pay for the damage, I can bet you that you will build resilient. So moral hazard is a concept that is not ridiculous in the context of natural disasters and federal aid.
So there's going to be a
I think part of what he's saying is that Puerto Rican people are resilient. So for you to say that it's a hazard.
No.
So let's stick with questions. Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Oh, sorry. He has the, sorry.
The question that I have is, why does the Oversight Board oppose an independent audit of the debt? Because usually in large bankruptcy cases, you have an independent examiner come in and issue a report concerning important issues in the case, because because it also relates to whether there have been crimes perpetrated in relationship with the issuance of the debt.
Okay, so we are conducting an investigation on the debt. It's an independent. It's independent. It's been handled by a firm of former prosecutors. I think Carlos was mentioning that to me before, and it is going to be rendering a report, and that report will be made public. And that report may very well be the basis of what you're saying, which is to bring whatever actions may be needed at that point.
We've only got a few minutes left.
How come the Oversight Board has not sought a moratorium on the bankruptcy cases so is stabilized?
On that, oops, sorry, that's a nice one, sorry. On that, actually, there is a school of thought that the sooner you bring this to a close, the better for Puerto Rico. The sooner you bring this Title III actions, you present your plan of adjustments, you get a fresh start. Plan of adjustments means that creditors will be crammed down. The sooner you bring this to an end, the sooner there is the possibility of a fresh start for Puerto Rico. So that's...
Can I go next?
Sir.
Thank you. Quick question. Name is Thomas Lopez Pia. I'm an affordable housing professional. I think somebody at the end mentioned that Puerto Rico's housing stock, like X percentage, is that being warehoused by people that don't live there as vacation homes, or what is the thinking behind that?
Okay,
but who owns it and why is it vacant?
So
Thank you.
There's a variety of
Can I answer the question?
Ah, sorry. You can answer whatever you want. Don't worry.
Well, our estimate.
We don't have much time.
Our estimate is that 22% of the housing stock is vacant. That's owned by a diversity of people, circumstances, but only about a fraction of 1% is owned by the banks through foreclosure and the like. There are a lot of empty houses. There are a lot of people that left and are still paying mortgage, or their properties are vacant. Families that die and don't know what to do with the land or the houses. But the fact is that the accumulation of all these exodus, that's what it means. So think about the rebuilding of the construction industry in Puerto Rico, where there is no need to build housing for the next 2 decades. Think about that.
Well, I was just going to add that there's also issues with foreclosed properties that are still being held in banking or financial institutions that buy them at a steep discount and can just hold on to them. And the way that property rights, the way that property laws operate in Puerto Rico, it's not like here or in New Jersey, for example, that if somebody's not keeping their property up to a certain standard, you as a neighbor sue the financial institution and try to get that stock moving in the market at the price, whatever price it is. In Puerto Rico, the laws are actually structured in a way that incentivizes that warehousing. So that's also a factor.
Yes.
Forgive me if I'm wrong, but I have a question. If we were barred from filing for Chapter 9 in bankruptcy, but Louisiana did Chapter 9 as a state, why are we held to the same standards?
I don't believe Louisiana, as a state, filed. The only Chapter 9s are by cities or some municipal entities. I believe that the only state bankruptcy was, I believe, Arkansas back in the Depression era, and it wasn't under a federal system.
But our bankruptcy was different.
In New York?
It's not a true. Our bankruptcy is not a true bankruptcy. The bankruptcy filed by Puerto Rico is not a true bankruptcy under Chapter 11.
No,
Am I correct?
it's a restructuring process under Title III of PROMISA. It is a judicial process. It incorporates section of the bankruptcy code, but it is a separate structure, legal structure that exists under Chapter 9 of the bankruptcy code that is only available for municipal entities and cities, except for those in Puerto Rico.
Okay, quick question.
Hi. So I think that you mentioned a premise that I'm not sure that everyone here shares, which is getting everyone on the same page. And a premise that has been underlying this conversation is the presence of the board as a legitimate one, as being one that we should just take for granted as one. And that's not a premise that's shared by really the majority of people on the island, right, that continue to oppose the presence of the board, the existence of the board, and lately, the extension of the board to try to secure additional powers that even Congress and a federal judge has said, and the government of Puerto Rico is also agreed. So I'm wondering if the panelists can comment on, and maybe starting with Annette, on what the sentiment continues to exist in a post-Hurricane Puerto Rico around the role of the board and the board as a legitimate or not institution.
Thank you
Quickly, Annette.
thank you for the question. I've been trying to intervene, but it's been difficult with almost all my panel. So I have to say that, yes, the sentiment in Puerto Rico is that the Fiscal Control Board is not a valid entity. We don't really feel any trust in the members of this club. And we had no chance whatsoever to participate even in the nomination process, or even, we were never consulted when this particular committee was imposed on us, right? So there's no legitimacy on the control board and whatever they do. And one question that we all have in Puerto Rico, and it's asked over and over again, is, you know, the whole discussion is also premised on the validity of this debt that we all have to pay somehow. And I think the one concern that we all have, if we have to choose one, is why? Why are we not talking about cutting the debt? It is an outstanding debt, it is unsustainable, and there are various reasons to think that most of it is actually illegal. So
I think, okay. Agree. Let's just try and, excuse me, let's just take a couple more questions. So, go ahead.
Thank you.
Oh, sorry. Next.
So I apologize earlier. I was trying to make a separate point, so I apologize about that. I just wanted to say that the Puerto Rican people are resilient people, whether we're on the island or we're here. And no disrespect to the men on the board, but I've been going to meeting after meeting after meeting after meeting, and it's always men who are saying what we must do for the island. And I would like to ask this question directly to Ms. Martinez. What, in your opinion, and in your experience as a Puerto Rican woman from the island, what are your proposals and your answers for how we can resolve this from the island to the island of Manhattan here? And in your opinion, as a woman there, what do the Puerto Rican people want? How can you speak to us instead of having talking heads, instead of having politicians, instead of having board members tell us what we need to see? What is your perspective in terms of what would work for the island and its people?
thank you so much for your question. There are many things that we can do. But the first one, I think, as I said before, we need to face the reality that we are a territory, a colony of the United States, and that is an issue that needs to be solved. The second thing is that this outstanding debt needs to be audited. There is a consensus among very well-respected economists that say, hey, and there was a very recent report that came out just this past week by Professor Martin Guzman. I invite you to go and see it. It is on Espacios Abiertos website available. And this very recent report, what they say, that Professor Guzman say, is that if we don't cut this debt, and what he's saying is almost all of it needs to be eliminated, we will not see, there's no way that we will see a recovery on our economy for the next 20 years, and even after that. So what we are looking at here is that my children, my 2.5 boy and my 5-year-old girl will probably have no opportunities and live in a very difficult situation in Puerto Rico unless we move, and that's the problem. You know, the whole politics behind it, and this is how we see it now, is to either make us leave the island, and one should wonder why. You know, what we are seeing is disaster capitalism on its way. We need to stop it.
Thank you.
So just to briefly say, cut the debt, audit it, make responsible thus those people and government officers that actually put us in this situation, and also make a restructuring of the debt that does not include more austerity measures. Instead, put an investment on public education, put back that investment on our health system, and make Congress, actually make Congress pay for that, what they owe to Puerto Rico.
Thank you.
Excuse me, excuse me, excuse me. Excuse me.
And I agree with you, Sobrino. It's true. Puerto Ricans on the island and the diaspora have the capability and the wherewithal and the intelligence to rebuild a resilient and just recovery for Puerto Rico. But it's going to be the people, not the politicians and not La Junta. Because you guys have already shown and capable of doing that. By your corruption, by your greed, by lending Puerto Rico, giving Puerto Rico to the disaster capitalists. So how do you reconcile what you just said, that Puerto Ricanos can and could be responsible for our own recovery, our own just recovery, when just today, when Naomi Klein, the author of the shock doctrine and disaster capitalism that you're sure well of, because you've been an author, you've been instrumental in the disasters in Latin America, and I know you're pretty proud of that. How do you reconcile that with saying that, with the same day that Naomi Klein steps foot in Puerto Rico, with the governor saying that they're going to privatize Prepa, the energy company? How disgusting is that? Puerto Rico
Okay,
should be
okay.
for who? For the venture capitalists? For the vulture funds? For the John Paulson of this world? Why? Why is he doing that? How can you justify that?
Sir.
You saw the airport. You saw the highway. You saw the public education. You said in Puerto Rico, up on our feet, the fire sale prices, the top wages, and we're not going to stand for it. Please follow our Just Recovery Puerto Rico NYC. It's going to be up to us, the people in Puerto Rico, not the politicians and not the Junta. Al carajo con la Junta.
Last question.
Thank you. So there are two events that I was wondering if our panelists could help us out with. The first one is earlier in the year, the current president of the Government Development Bank, who's sitting in the panel, signed on to a debt restructuring agreement for the Government Development Bank that would repay any debt that was found to be illegal in any investigation. And then the second event is a court filing on behalf of the Unsecured Creditors Committee saying that the Oversight Board refused to answer any questions on behalf of the committee to explain the relationship between the independent investigator that was hired by the board and one of the members of the board, namely Carlos Garcia. My question is, would either of these events have anything to do with the relationship between Garcia, the government, and his presence in the board, or is it both? What's the answer for that?
What was the first part of the question?
Hello? The law that would allow for a restructuring or the voluntary restructuring of the Government Development Bank's debt includes an article that states that any debt that is found to be illegal or non-conforming to law would have to be repaid in accordance with the terms of the restructuring agreement. Now, you said that was perfectly fine and it was according to industry standards.
No, that's not what the law says. What the law says is that the transfer of the asset...
Excuse me, it's in Section 701 of said law.
The transfer of the asset, the debt asset that's being included in the recovery trust, that instrument is affirmed by the bank that's transferring it to that trust. That type of ratification of the debt that is illegal or whatnot, that is not, you can't ratify something that's, that would be found illegal if it wasn't constituted appropriately. So what you're referring to is a section that, that authorizes the transfer from the bank into that liquidation trust. That is what you're referring to. And that is consistent with practices in the Municipal Finance Authority and other laws in Puerto Rico that have had to do that type of transfer of an asset. Regarding the other, I don't think Carlos even likes me, so I don't know what you were talking about.
Okay, with that, thank you all for your patience and interest, and viva Puerto Rico.
And I do want to thank We agree. Can I speak? All right, so on behalf of everyone in the City Bar, thank you all for coming, including those with opinions. You should know that several of the most pointed questions addressed to the panel came from members of the task force. So we have a lot of work to be done to consider everything that was discussed here today, and we will get to it. Have a good night.